Hi there, and welcome to the Wednesday show. It's July 3rd as I'm taping this. I am your host, Pete Dominic, and joining me today, Kenneth C. Davis, my favorite historian. Why? Well, because Dahlia Lithwick, one of my favorite legal experts, said yesterday or Monday, as an official representative of Legal Commentariat, I want to suggest that tonight's a good news cycle to talk to the fascism and authoritarianism experts. This is their inning now. Well, we're still in that news cycle and that time, so I've got the great historian Kenneth C. Davis, author of Strongman, to talk about authoritarianism as well as Independence Day and where we are at in America today. Great conversation. If you want to jump to it, it does begin at 24 minutes. But I know you want to stay for my news rundown because it is the best in the entire business of daily podcasts. No one does it better, says the New York Times. Nobody says that. I don't know. But a lot of people do love it and say they're here for it, and I thank you very much for that. Especially because I won't be hosting tomorrow night's Hangout because it's the 4th of July and I'm actually driving down to speak at another youth conference. It's the Student Climate Conservation Congress at the National Conservation Training Center, which I'm going back to. And so I won't be able to host a Hangout tomorrow night, but I might do something over the weekend, or I might do a couple of Hangouts a week coming up in these next few weeks. And maybe even until the election. I don't know what I'll have time for, but I'm really glad that we did it Monday night. And if you want to watch or listen to that Hangout, which many of you like to after it's over, the link to that is in the email to subscribers from Patreon that I send every day. If you're not getting it, email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. I'll include the link to Monday's Hangout in today's show email as well. All right, well, let's get to your headlines. The most important story in the country certainly is the decisions that the Supreme Court have made. And that's why I have my guest, Kenneth C. Davis, on to talk about that most important story. And certainly I will be talking about the consequences of the Supreme Court decision with other experts coming up. The other big story, of course, yesterday is President Biden. Is he going to continue? Is he going to withdraw? Where is the pressure coming from? Where is the argument online between us? Well, here is Politico Playbook last night. Cracks in the foundation. After days of lining up behind President Joe Biden, prominent Democrats are starting to go public with concerns about his age and his ability to stay on the ticket. First, it was Congressman Lloyd Doggett. Shout out to Isaac, who is a longtime listener down there in Texas, who said that's his guy, his representative. Well, Lloyd Doggett became the first sitting congressperson to directly call for Biden to step aside. And former Representative Tim Ryan also called for Biden to leave the race, but he's a bit of an opportunist. Congressman Jim Clyburn, one of Biden's strongest supporters, signaled he'd support Vice President Kamala Harris if Biden were to leave the race. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said it's a, quote, legitimate question to say, is this an episode or is this a condition? She said this through a spokesperson. Later, she said she had full confidence in President Biden. Senator Peter Welch of Vermont and Representative Mike Quigley of Illinois also expressed concerns about the president and his campaign operation. So those are just a few names of the Democrats who are either in office or recently left office who are starting to question President Biden. So it's just a crack, and we'll see if he becomes anything bigger than that. And it's, I think, hour to hour, day to day to see what is going to happen. The president is sitting down with ABC's George Stephanopoulos at some point soon, and that's going to be a very important interview. I think it's going to air this Friday with extended portions on Saturday and Sunday. I really wish they wouldn't do that. I always hate when they just put the goddamn interview out so we can see it in its full context right away, ABC, needing to get ratings. Well, let me get to some of the other headlines I've got for you. Let's go to France, where the elections are a very important thing and will determine a lot about the future of the world. It looks like French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron's centrists and left-wing alliance have reportedly agreed to form a united front to defeat the far right. 200 candidates from both just pulled out of the second round, leaving just contenders with the best chance of beating the nationalist candidates. And so that Looks like some smart politics and good news coming from France. I'll continue to follow their elections, and the move to the right in Europe is something I'm paying a lot of attention to, talking to experts about here on the show. Now let's go to New York, where the big story from the Attorney General was supposed to be that he was turning in his sentencing guidelines for the disgraced former president. It wouldn't be announced, but he was turning them in, what he thought, and then they would be announced a few days before the upcoming Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Well, that's been delayed as a result of the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity. The hearing will now be delayed at least till September 8th. Judge Merchan in the New York criminal trial said yesterday he approved of a delay of the former president's sentencing after his lawyers asked for more time to review the potential impact of the Supreme Court's immunity decision. But over on the Twitter machine, Andrew Weissman said, Judge Merchan moving the sentencing to mid-September is smart. It gives Trump and the DA, the court, time to brief the issues, but Merchan will ultimately reject the weak Trump claims. And importantly, the new mid-September sentencing date will make it very hard for Trump to then be able to appeal to the Supreme Court before the election, as he will have to appeal within New York state courts first. So that's a very important note and date change. Now, speaking of disgraced lawyers, it's Rudy Giuliani, the disgraced former New York City mayor who tried to overturn former disgraced President Donald Trump's election loss. Well, guess what? He is more disgraced. That's right. He's been disbarred in the state of New York as of yesterday. Yet another repercussion for the team that spread lies about mass voter fraud after Joe Biden's 2020 presidential victory. And a related story, the latest J6er has been sentenced. A Florida man, love how that starts, was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison Tuesday for assaulting police during the Capitol riot. He's a 54-year-old guy from Tampa. He accepted a plea deal in February for one felony count of assaulting and resisting or impeding police. Wow, there you go. Well, encouraging news or statement from the Fed. Inflation in the United States is slowing again after higher readings earlier this year, according to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, saying this yesterday, while adding that more such evidence would be needed before the Fed would cut interest rates. After some persistently high inflation reports at the start of 2024, Jerome Powell said the data for April and May, quote, do suggest we are getting back on a disinflationary path. That's good timing for the Democrat, Joe Biden, or whoever it is. Come November 5th, also auto sales grew slightly in the second quarter, but at Tesla, they fell for the second quarter in a row. I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it. And the U.S. government, which everybody loves to hate, will pay the vaccine maker Moderna $176 million to develop a vaccine for the bird flu. They're paying to accelerate development of pandemic influenza vaccines that could be used to treat bird flu in people, as concern now growing about cases in dairy cows across the country, according to federal officials yesterday. And how about this news from the border? Illegal crossings along the U.S. border fell to a 3-year low in June, following President Biden's drastic move to curtail asylum and continued efforts by Mexico to stop migrants heading north, according to preliminary Customs and Border Protection data obtained by CBS News. So how about that? Illegal crossings on the border falling to a 3-year low. Go share that with your right-wing friend or neighbor. I'm sure they'll be really welcome to it. Where'd you get that news? And this is a headline that will make you say, The Trump Organization has signed a new deal with Saudi real estate company to build a residential high-rise in the Tower of Jeddah, extending the family's close ties with the Saudi kingdom. Isn't that interesting? And shouldn't it be illegal? Come on. And here's a case worth watching. The House Judiciary Committee filed a lawsuit Monday against Attorney General Merrick Garland over the Justice Department's refusal to release audio of a special counsel interview the President Biden had. A transcript of the interview with President Biden has been released, but the president earlier this year invoked executive privilege over the audio. So we'll keep our eyes on that. Let's see, a couple more quick headlines. The FDA approved a new drug to treat Alzheimer's disease that could modestly slow cognitive decline in early stages, but also carries safety risks. Climate news. Alaska's huge Juneau ice field is melting twice as quickly as it did before 2010, which is an incredibly worrying situation, according to researchers. The Biden administration announced the first national heat protections for workers, and if you want to keep those in effect, then you're going to have to vote for President Biden or whoever is on the ticket in November. his soul, his essence, whatever it takes. More than 100 people were killed in a stampede in India that was reportedly driven by heat and overcrowding during a religious event. And here's an interesting story from Nature. A new study shows that ants who were recently observed using amputations to treat injuries, the only animal besides humans known to conduct amputations to treat injuries. That was interesting. And finally, yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act being signed into law in 1964 by then President Lyndon Johnson. The legislation prohibited discrimination based on race, color, sex, national origin, or religion. It banned discrimination in public accommodations, schools, voting, and in employment. And that is where I will start with audio. Those are your headlines. Now let's get to the sound bites. As a result of and because it's the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act being signed, here is Dr. Martin Luther King on CBS's Face the Nation discussing the strategy to get the Civil Rights Bill passed. This clip, by the way, was shared yesterday by Dr. King's daughter, Bernice King, who quoted her mom, Coretta, when saying, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation." And added, "Our work for civil rights is not done." Here's Dr. King on Face the Nation.
What difference, Dr. King, will passage or non-passage of the Civil Rights Bill make in all your plans for the summer's demonstrations? I mean, will they go on if it passes, and if it doesn't pass, will it make any difference?
Well, I'm sure we will have demonstrations whether you get a civil rights bill passed or not. Now, I would say that if the bill is passed, it will increase the hope and give the Negro a new faith in the legislative process, and I think it will be possible to keep the demonstrations much more disciplined and nonviolent. On the other hand, if the bill passes, we can see another element present, namely that it will be necessary to enforce it. Passing the bill is simply one step. After it is passed, it must be enforced, and we will have to go into communities all over the South to test compliance. There will be some communities that will comply, and maybe in these communities we won't have to have large-scale demonstrations, but where you have outright resistance and a refusal to comply with the Civil Rights Bill if it passes, we will have to demonstrate in order to get the federal government to take a stand in the area of enforcement.
It wasn't good enough to pass legislation. It had to be enforced, is basically what it sounds like he was saying. And of course, they did pass that legislation shortly after that interview. All right, let's move on to other sound that I've got for you from yesterday. A lot of people are talking about this scary short moment quote on one of these right-wing Real America's Voice, I guess is the name of this show. Well, here is the guy leading Trump's 2025 project.
That we are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
Oh, good. Well, we're in the middle of a revolution, and as long as the left gives up, then we won't have a problem. That's Kevin Roberts, very dangerous, violent-sounding insurrectionist, if you ask me. I saw that clip go, everybody sharing that clip last night, so I wanted to make sure that you heard it. And if we didn't have this flood of other really important news, you would think that RFK Jr. was having the worst day ever, but not a good day for him. Vanity Fair put out this big expose, and one seemingly new thing we learned is that he appears to have once been involved with the barbecue of a dog. Photos of him holding a barbecue dog. It's just too hard to even talk about, much less see. But here he is being asked on Fox News about this yesterday.
This Vanity Fair story, I want to give you an opportunity to address it, that has a picture of you holding up what looks like a carcass of a dog and pretending to take a bite out of it. It's getting a lot of attention. So I want to ask you if you want to explain that photo. Is that a cheap fake? Is that a real photo? What was going on there?
Now, that is a real photo. It's of me at a campfire in Patagonia on the Futalefu River eating a goat, which is what we eat down there. Vanity Fair said that they talked to veterinarians who assured them that it was a dog. That they had meta-analysis that showed that it was in Korea and that it was in Korea of me eating a dog, and that statement is emblematic of the entire article, of the lack of sort of journalistic standards throughout that article.
Okay. I'm glad we gave you the opportunity to address that.
Okay, so it was a goat, not a dog, according to RFK. Well, that's not how the internet is perceiving it, and apparently a lot of experts that were interviewed for the story. Now, here is another bad moment from another interview that RFK did yesterday. He also, in this article, was accused of sexual assault allegations by a former babysitter, and, well, he didn't want to comment on that.
Vanity Fair came.
Oh, and, in terms of the other allegations, I've said this from the beginning. I am not a church boy. I am not running like that. I had a very, very rambunctious youth. I said in my announcement speech that I have so many skeletons in my closet that if they could all vote, I could run for king of the world. Mm-hmm. So, this Vanity Fair is recycling 30-year-old stories, and I'm not, going to comment on the details of any of them, but I am who I am.
You're talking there about the nanny situation. I mean, I do have to ask her. I mean, are you denying it or not?
I'm not going to comment on it.
All right. Well, I gave you the opportunity, and officially it's a goat.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to comment on it. Sounds like yes. And also, I have more skeletons in my closet. If they could all vote, then I would be elected king. It seems like a slogan that we could put on an RFK sign and throw it in your lawn. Who would want to vote for somebody who has so many skeletons in your closet? It's a weird thing to admit, but he's got to get out front of it because articles like this are going to keep exposing him the closer that he gets to being on the ballot in different states, which apparently is what he is trying to do. And so far hasn't been a great success. So that's good. All right. Well, the president, for his part, was out yesterday making comments and talking about the impacts of climate change, because yesterday they announced, as I mentioned earlier, these new regulations for extreme weather to protect workers. So this is what President Biden sounded like yesterday.
Unfortunately, my predecessor and the MAGA Republicans in Congress are trying to undo all this progress. They still deny climate change even exists. They deny climate change even exists. They must be living in a hole somewhere, at the expense of health and safety of their own constituents. They deny it exists. Every single congressional Republican voted against the investments which created these jobs and combat climate change. Many of them are trying to repeal those climate provisions and kill those jobs. I quite frankly think it's not only outrageous, it's really stupid. Everyone who willfully denies the impacts of climate change is condemning the American people to a dangerous future, and either is really, really dumb or has some other motive of that. How can you deny there's climate change, for God's sake?
All right, that's what President Biden sounded like yesterday, and here is what his spokeswoman, Karine Jean-Pierre, sounded like at the briefing yesterday when she was defending him.
The debate, the president had a cold. He had a hoarse voice. You all heard it. That's why you reached out. But I will say this, and the president said this over the past couple of days, certainly right after the debate. He knows how to do the job. And he knows how to do the job, not because he says it, because his record proves it. Because for 3.5 years, almost 4 years, the president's record has been unprecedented, delivering for the American people. Another thing that he said that I would add is he knows right from wrong. He knows how to tell the truth. And again, he knows how to deliver for the American people. Joe Biden is a person. Take away his title. He is someone who has dealt with tragedy. He is someone who has confronted that head on. He is someone who knows how to get back up once you've been knocked down. That is something that he understands very, very well. And I think, and we believe, that's something that many of Americans across the country understand as well. And he knows how to come back. He knows how to come back. And so the president's going to continue to focus on what he's been doing the past 3.5 years. He's going to continue to focus on the American people. And
Well, it sounds like Karine Jean-Pierre got his back, just a little bit of her statement yesterday. And the guy that wants to take back the White House, the disgraced former president, some new released audio came out from him saying that it doesn't matter if a person is the most horrible human being because the only thing that matters are ratings. So this guy, Ramin Setoda, who has written a new post-presidency biography about Trump titled Apprentice in Wonderland. And in recent weeks, he's given multiple outlets audio of conversations that he had with the disgraced former president. Last month, he revealed that Trump told him that ratings are, quote, my whole life. Well, this latest audio clip of Trump underscores that sentiment. And I'm going to play it for you. So, trigger alert, I am playing the president. Many of the former president. Many of you really don't like hearing his voice. I get it. This clip's about 1 minute, 6 seconds with Nicole Wallace on MSNBC introducing it.
Over the past few weeks, author, journalist Ramin Setoda has been sharing with us remarkable, new, never heard before tape recordings from a half a dozen sit-down interviews he did with the disgraced ex-president after he lost, the former Apprentice host, like this one. Tapes that cut to the very core of who Donald Trump really actually is.
So, if I went back to NBC right now to do something, they would do anything I wanted to do. Show business, I'm talking about. Doing a show, anything I wanted to do right now, 100%. Because one thing I know about that business, and I learned that business better than anybody else can learn a business in a short period of time, it's all about one thing, ratings. If you have ratings, you can be the meanest, most horrible human being in the world. Mm-hmm. There's only one thing that matters, ratings. Uh-huh. You can be nice or you can be mean. You can be evil, you can be horrible, you can be crude or elegant. There's only one thing that matters, and that's ratings. Uh-huh. If you don't have ratings, it doesn't matter.
Gross and wildly unsurprising. Well, all of the late night comedians are off this week, but I'm not. I'm here with you, pumping out new episodes, new conversations, new experts, and a daily news update every day. But I do have JL Cauvin stand up from this past weekend in Washington, D.C., where he is performing at the D.C. Comedy Loft. Post-debate, this was one of his funny, hilarious moments.
Trump, the bar is lower than this basement for Trump, and it was like, just don't rape anybody during the debate. 90 minutes. Can you do it, sir? I can do it. I can do that. I can probably do double that. No sexual assault during the debate. Easy. Watch this. And he didn't, and everybody was like, disciplined Trump. He's disciplined. We like that. But to be fair, Joe Biden, when he walked out on that stage, I said, is that the ghost of Joe Biden? He was so white, before he even started attempting to speak, he was so white, I thought he had borrowed like the makeup from the Wayans brothers from White Chicks. He looked a level of white that's, if you're in a paint store, it'd be Undertaker. You want Undertaker white? He was dead. He was dead. I think if we lower the bar for Trump, why don't we start the narrative like, excuse me, Joe Biden wasn't alive. Did you see how well he did for a dead guy? Yeah, I'm okay with that. If he does that while dead, imagine the leadership he can show when his pulse comes back. But we only do it for Trump. We only give Trump like the lowest possible bar. But Biden was awful during the debate. I felt many of us, good people, I shouldn't say all of us, the good people in the room felt disheartened and terrible.
There you go, JL Cauvin. Always funny, even in the darkest of moments. Some of you probably didn't like that, but there you go. I thought it was pretty good at the Comedy Club this past weekend. That's what I've got for you in sound bites and headlines. And now it is time to get to my conversation with Kenneth C. Davis. He really is my favorite historian. His Don't Know Much series is all on my bookcase. Don'tKnowMuch.com. Don't know much about the Bible, Civil War, geography, history, American presidents, Americans' hidden history. Don't know much about mythology, more deadly than war, In the Shadow of Liberty. And today I wanted to talk to him about his expertise on authoritarians because he wrote Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. Last year, he wrote great short books, and this October, his new book, The World in Books, 52 works of great short nonfiction, is coming out. I'm very excited to talk with him about that. I got a preview at the very end of our interview, but we had a great conversation. I was so happy he was able to join me. We talked a little bit about the history of July 4th, and I was going to air this on July 4th. You'll hear me reference that, but I thought it was the most relevant right now, which is why Dahlia Lithwick and others said we should be talking to historians and experts on authoritarianism. So that's what I did. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Kenneth C. Davis joins me now. There's so much to talk with you about. How have you been? Thank you for joining me.
I've been like everybody else, Pete, watching and listening and wondering where we were headed. And it's been a roller coaster of emotions. It's been a roller coaster of history. And here we are in 2024, coming up very soon on the 250th birthday of America, in a couple of years. And, a lot of things that we had taken for granted, perhaps, this American exceptional idea, the notion that we were built on these founding principles, and obviously some people have very different views of what those founding principles mean. And so we're at a really perilous time in the history of this republic. And I don't say that lightly. I lived through, 1968 and Vietnam. I lived through Watergate and all of that, what that meant. And, we've been through all the ups and downs, the election of 2000, which I think is a very pertinent subject to what we're talking about this moment. So I come to you today with far less optimism and American, feel good than I typically had. A few years ago, I revised my book, Don't Know Much About History, and an earlier version had talked about an era of broken faith in America. And then when I revised the book a few years ago, I wrote about an era of broken democracy. And, unfortunately, that's kind of where we are right now. We are in an era of broken democracy, and people are really wondering, rightfully, if we're seeing the end of, some era in American history.
Well, I pretty much thought that you would say something along those lines, and obviously it's extremely disconcerting, terrifying, and we're all pretty angst-ridden about what we're seeing happening in America right now. But I want to take us back, as you always do, to the founding, because I wanted to start by asking you about the idea of separation in church and state. We've got Bibles being forced in the classroom. The 10 Commandments have to be posted on the wall in Louisiana. This Christian nationalism movement has gained so much momentum and so many actual state house and congressional seats in legislative districts. So what did the founders believe about religion, separation of church and state? How do you look at that today?
It's a really good and fair and important question, and it's something I've written about quite a bit over my career. I remember, writing some years ago for the New York Times about when they were talking about the Pledge of Allegiance, and we're contesting whether the Pledge of Allegiance should be said in classrooms, and people were knocking that idea down. And I pointed to the fact that men like Jefferson, author of the Declaration, principal author of the Declaration of Independence, men like James Madison, who we call the father of our Constitution, George Washington, certainly, John Adams, certainly, were all nominally Christian, but they were powerfully concentrated on the idea that the government is about preserving our rights, not saving our souls. And they wanted to separate the two, and they wanted to develop a secular government. They fought a war starting in 1775, although we, celebrate 1776. They fought a war that lasted many years, more than 8 years until it was finally all over, against a country in which the head of the state was also the head of the church. They understood very carefully, I'm talking about the King of England was officially the head of the Church of England. They understood very clearly the wars that had been fought throughout Europe for centuries. since the Reformation and going forward over religion, and not between, Christians and other religions, between Christians, primarily between Catholics and Protestants. Right. It was a conflict that shaped our history in many respects, and I've written about that in a number of books. So this is a question I believe we should have settled a long time ago, and we haven't, because it's a very, very profound, deep stream that runs through America, this idea that we are a Christian nation, which we are not. Yes, almost all of the men who signed the Declaration, all of the men who signed the Constitution were nominally at least Christians, but they were also profoundly believing the idea that the government should not tell you which prayers you can say, or whether you can say prayers at all, or whether you must say prayers. They understood that. They built it into the Constitution. Article 6 talks about no test of religion ever for any office in the nation. And of course, then the First Amendment is added to the Constitution, which says the government should not establish a religion nor prevent someone from practicing it. It's a double-edged sword. But this has been a stream throughout our history, and it's many times it's come to violence. And I've written about this a great deal in my book. For instance, A Nation Rising, I talked about the whole early 19th century movement called nativism, which was very Protestant and very anti-immigrant. And those two things have gone together for a long time as well. Right. Once upon a time, the people who were dirty, dangerous outsiders bringing in disease were Irish Catholics. And there was a very violent history in this country of the war, the outright civil war between Protestants and Irish Catholics for the most part. And that has continued throughout our history. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960 as the first Catholic, Billy Graham and another very important religious leader of the time named Norman Vincent Peale really did their best to make sure John F. Kennedy wasn't elected. And that was not because they were Republicans. It was because they were Protestants, and they did not believe that a Catholic should be president in this country. We've come a long way from there, but not completely. And this strain of nativist Christian idealism that says this is a Christian nation and we should put Bibles in the classroom and have the Ten Commandments on the wall are completely at odds with the foundational principles in the United States Constitution. But it's a war that continues, and right now it seems to be swinging very clearly in the direction of Christian nationalists.
What else did the founding fathers say in terms of the power of the executive branch? It's a famous story, I guess, about George Washington turning down more power. And now what we're seeing the Supreme Court decide, and what we've seen this movement towards, is this what's called unitary executive, more power for the executive branch. What can you say about what the founders thought about the balance of power, whether it be the courts or the legislative and executive branch? There was obviously a big fight about that.
This has been a big fight from the time that the Constitution was drafted. It was probably the thing they argued about most in terms of a single issue, was how much power to give this position called the president. There was a notion, for instance, in 1787, when they're drafting the Constitution in Philadelphia, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence had been written and adopted in the same building, they were talking a lot about how much power should be given to this man. There was an idea that it shouldn't be one man. It should be an executive committee, which was shot down. There was the notion that it would be a single term of maybe 6 years rather than a 4-year term with no limits. And remember, of course, that there was no limit on presidents being reelected until after Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected for a fourth term. And that's when the amendment was made to limit a president to 2 terms. So this is a question that has run through our history, but there's no question in my mind when you go back and look at the Constitution and read the arguments at the time that they were very, very concerned about the idea of a strong man coming along, perhaps at the head of an army, and taking power and keeping it. These were men who were for all their flaws, and their flaws are many, their contradictions are many. They were slaveholders, obviously, something I've written about in the book In the Shadow of Liberty. But they believed very clearly in this idea that there should be this balance of powers between the 3 branches of government, and that those powers should be checked. That's this idea of checks and balances that you should have learned about in maybe 6th or 7th grade, but I'm not sure we're teaching that level of civics anymore. So they were afraid of exactly the kind of man, and George Washington would have been a perfect example of it, except that he proved just the opposite. When the men are meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, and they're talking about what the president should be and what his powers should be and how long he should serve, George Washington is sitting right there, somewhat quietly at the front of the room. He is presiding over this convention, and there's no question in anyone's mind that the first president is going to be George Washington. Now, Washington had done something extraordinary when the war ended. He said his farewell. He could have taken an army, and there was no Washington, D.C. at the time, but seized power in when the war ended, 1781. He didn't. He retired, went back to his home. He was very much modeling himself on the ideas and ideals of the Roman Republic, where generals usually served their time and then went back to their farms. The opposite of that, of course, was Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar was the man who brought the Republic of Rome down. And the founders were very, very aware of that history. They knew their classical history. They knew that most republics had ended when a strong man, a general, had come along and seized power, like Julius Caesar. So they were very cognizant of the history, and they were very fearful of giving such a man too much power. And of course, when I say a man, that's what they were talking about. Of course, we weren't thinking about women in any of these roles, and certainly they weren't voting for the president and wouldn't for another 2 centuries. So this is a really important argument that's going on in Philadelphia in 1787. How much power to give the president, and they clearly wanted to limit those powers. Then they came up with the idea, and Benjamin Franklin was the one who framed it perfectly. He said, what if this person isn't very good? What if he's corrupt or criminal? Or what are we going to do? If we don't have some way of getting rid of the president, there'll only be assassination. And he didn't say that jokingly. I think he meant it. So that's where they came up with the idea that drew again on British law, because most of these men knew British law, British common law. And they came up with this idea of impeachment, that the president could be removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors, but they set the bar very high in terms of how he could be removed. And that's why throughout our history, we've had 4 impeachments of presidents now, but none has been removed from office because it is a very high bar. But these are all arguments that were central to the beginning and the foundation of the Republic. And first of all, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a lawyer. Second of all, I know the history of the Constitution pretty well, but I'm not a constitutional scholar on the level of, somebody like Amir Reed of Yale, who's written wonderful books about the Constitution. I rely upon them and their knowledge when I talk about this stuff. But it's clear to me that this notion of an unlimited executive would have been the farthest thing from the minds of men like Jefferson, who wasn't involved in the Constitution, but certainly Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. They would have been frightened by the idea of giving a president unlimited, unchecked powers. And in many respects, reading this decision from a couple of days ago, we moved the pendulum much further, the scales much further in the direction of a president with very, very unlimited powers.
Just going back to the separation of church and state, I should have asked you this earlier, but I forgot this quote I wanted to mention from the now House Speaker Mike Johnson, who he has spent much of his career trying to advocate for what he refers as religious freedom in schools, government, and elsewhere. Of course, I wouldn't call it freedom, but he says the separation of church and state is a misnomer. He says people understand it. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution. What he was explaining is that they did not want the government to encroach upon the church, not that they didn't want principles of faith to have influence in our public life. It's exactly the opposite. That's his interpretation. That's the current Speaker of the House. What would you say to him?
Well, the words separation of church and state might not be in the Constitution, but these words are. This is Article 6 of the Constitution. The senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation, and we know what the oath is, to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. No religious test ever under any office. That, to me, is a pretty clear statement in the Constitution that religion is a private matter and should not be brought into the public domain. Then we have the First Amendment to the Constitution, which goes further and makes it even clearer. And because it's so important, I will read it. Forgive me.
Go ahead, please.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I don't know how much clearer it can be. If you put the Ten Commandments on the wall, if you require Bibles in the classroom, you are establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, that's the sort of balancing act that we've always been in. So the government can't tell you that you must pray, how you must pray, what prayers you must say, which books you can read, but they also can't prevent you from reading those on your own, that this is a matter of private conscience. Perhaps the best refutation of all these things came from James Madison, and he actually wrote it anonymously. It was called a remonstrance. I've written about it in a couple of my books, and I wrote about it in a Smithsonian article called The History of Religious Tolerance in America, which is on my website, don'tknowmuch.com. He said that, first of all, this is the question then was, should tax dollars go to ministers of the what we would call the Episcopal Church? They called the Anglican Church at that time. And Madison argued against this. He did not think that the public should be paying for religious teaching. And he eventually wins that argument. And the Virginia Bill of Rights, which is passed because of that, really becomes then the basis for the First Amendment. This is an argument that happened before the Constitution was even drafted. But this was a core principle for Madison. And one of the things he said was, first of all, Christianity has done pretty well on its own for 1,700 years. It doesn't need any help from the government. he also makes the argument that any government that can tell you you have to follow this religion can be changed and force you to follow another religion. So it's not just that the majority rules, but the idea that the governments should have no role in influencing or dictating what people's beliefs should be or must be. He finally argues that, I already mentioned it, Christianity had done very well through most of its history without any government support, and it should continue that way.
Well, one of the Louisiana legislators who supported and helped pass this 10 Commandment in the classroom bill, Lauren something, Ventrella or something, she's on CNN. She said, it says, God, we trust on our money. So that was one of the arguments that she made. Wasn't that done in like 1950?
That was placed on the money, I think, for the first time in the midst of the Civil War by a very, very devout Secretary of the Treasury, who also tried to put his own picture on the money. And so, it's in God we trust is, I think, a general and vague enough motto that, you can say, okay, in God we trust. Which God? Whose God? Are we talking about Allah, Jehovah, Yahweh, Jesus? That's
the tree gods,
the spaghetti monster,
the sun gods. Sure, it could be anything you want it, or no gods.
Pastafarians could, and of course there have been Satanists who have very cleverly countered some of these things, and said, well, if there's religious freedom, then we want to put when you put up the Christmas tree, we want to put a pentagram as well. So this is all part of a debate that's gone on for a long time in this country. This idea of the 10 Commandments, for instance, has been knocked down repeatedly over the centuries by the Supreme Court. But we have to be realistic right now and say we are in a completely different ballgame right now with this Supreme Court. Yeah. There have been a number of decisions in the past few years that have really chipped away at this very, very solid foundation of the separation of church and state. So would James Madison and George Washington have believed in providence, as they often described it? And did George Washington talk about providence? Did every president, for the most part, say, so help me God, even though the Constitution does not include those words in the oath of office? They were added, and nobody said, oh, you can't say that, because the First Amendment allows them to say that. But on the other hand, it's not required by the Constitution.
Anything else you want to say about the decisions that this Supreme Court have made from any kind of historical perspective? One thing, I don't know if you're enough of a scholar of the Constitution to examine this, but a lot of the people I talked to, especially Professor Eric Siegel, often points this idea of originalism has clearly been debunked, because the conservatives on the court that call themselves originalists, referring to the actual text of the Constitution, have clearly now proven they only do that sometimes. They so often don't do that. They pick and choose when they're going to refer to what's actually in the text of the Constitution, these textualists, these originalists. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
That's I'm going to completely defer to Mr. Siegel, because I think he's absolutely right by everything I have read and understood over the years, that these so-called originalists who were brought into office telling us that they weren't going to legislate anymore, they were only going to decide what the Constitution meant in its original form. They've actually, gone so far off the range that people are in disbelief about how far and how quickly we've come. And on that point, I think is perhaps a good place to finish when talking about the Supreme Court. This is not something that happened in the last 5 years, not something that happened in the last 10 years even. This is the process, and we've read, and a lot has been written about it, and we've seen all the articles about the influence of these very wealthy conservative Republicans in giving money to these Supreme Court justices, who then do not feel compelled to report such gifts. So this is a much longer process. This powerful right-wing conservative movement attempted to influence the courts and state legislatures through something called ALEC for a very, very long time. This has been going on for a long time. When Hillary Clinton, back in the 1990s, I think she was on the Today Show and said that she was the victim of a vast right-wing conspiracy, she was kind of mocked and derided. But when you look back at it now, and you see that the money that was going into influencing the course of of Supreme Court decisions, it was, in fact, something of a right-wing conspiracy. And it goes back, we have to be realistic, to the fact that the Supreme Court decided a presidential election in the year 2000 on partisan lines. That was really, if you want a starting point for this conversation, I think you have to go back and look at Bush v. Gore as the Supreme Court deciding who the president was going to be.
And of course, they decided it was Bush, and Bush, of course, appointed Alito. So
that's correct. And then there's a succession of Supreme Court decisions, starting especially with the case about money in politics, the
Citizens United, in 2010, I think.
Citizens United case. That opened the floodgates for these people who were now capable of pouring millions and potentially billions of dollars into transforming the judicial status in this country, transforming the electoral politics in this country, because money was now flowing freely. Then you get a few years later the decision in the voting rights case, which was written by John Roberts, in which he said that racism was really not a factor in America anymore, so we could just move on from that.
Right.
So there's been it's not one decision; it's a long history here, and that's why I say when I wrote in Don't Know Much About History that we had moved from an era of broken trust, that people were really unhappy from between Vietnam and Watergate, and then Enron and the breakdown of things in the economy, to this belief that now democracy itself was broken. And part of that is the fact that, even when we get a big turnout in a presidential election, we're talking about maybe 60% of the people vote. That's certainly part of the problem. That there was a take it for granted, or both sides are the same. They're two. It doesn't matter to me who's in charge. But now we can see that it really certainly does matter.
Yeah, you can say that again and again. So here is the tweet that made me start thinking about you from one of the most respected constitutional law scholars and legal experts in the country, Dahlia Lithwick. My friend Dahlia writes, as an official representative of the legal commentariat, I want to suggest that tonight's a good news cycle to talk to the fascism and authoritarianism experts. This is their inning now. You, sir, wrote this book, amongst many others, Strong Man, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. Do you think that Dahlia is right, and that you and other experts about these people, these men, and how they came to power should be those we're talking to right now?
Absolutely. I mean, we are seeing in many, many small incremental steps, and the things that certain politicians say they are going to do, we are hearing a parroting of things that certainly Mussolini said and did. People always immediately go to Hitler, and I always remind people that Hitler happened because Mussolini happened first, in a way. Mussolini paved the way. He showed the way for Hitler. Mussolini took power in Italy as part of an elected democracy under a constitutional monarchy. Italy was in a mess following World War I, as most of the world was. Poverty, the country was falling apart. There was no jobs, no work. One of the reasons that millions of Italians were emigrating to America at that time, which ended after World War I, by the way, with the end of with the most restrictive immigration law in our history in 1924, 100 years ago. Italians and Eastern Europeans were really targeted because they weren't considered white.
Right.
They weren't considered white Europeans. That's, part of this. They weren't considered the kind of Nordic white Christian people that America wanted to allow in. So Italians were kept out of the country after 1924. Just a good reminder of how the country's immigration policies have often been extremely, extremely vicious and nasty, and certainly driven by religion. So Mussolini comes into power, invited into power in 1922, very quickly starts to, first of all, one of his chief opponents in the Senate is assassinated, a man named Mattiatti. He's kidnapped, and his body was found a few weeks later. There was an outrage, calls for something, and Mussolini said, I had nothing to do with it, but later some fascist party members were convicted. But Mussolini moved on. 4 years after he took power in 1922, he was able to pass laws under the guise of national security to outlaw all other political parties. He also got a law passed that allowed the fascist regime to pick up people who were socialists, communists, anarchists, and without a trial, put them in detention. That is the course that the fascist takes. The use of propaganda. He was brilliant at propaganda, giving these blustery speeches, going to war. The motto of Mussolini was believe, obey, and fight. And he got the country to go along with that. He got the country to go along with that because he got the factory owners and the businessmen to go along with it, because what were they afraid of in 1922? They were afraid of Bolshevism. They had seen what happened in Russia. They did not want it to happen in Italy. They had seen the Tsar of Russia murdered by the Bolsheviks and the communists, and so the very powerful group in Italy obviously was the church still. And the church saw Mussolini as an ally in fighting godless communism. They had seen churches taken over by the communists in Russia. They did not want it to happen in Italy. So Mussolini had powerful, powerful allies in doing this, and very, very quickly took Italy, which was a very, very disunited and chaotic state, and turned it into a one-party state. And he ruled it for the next 20 years, taking it eventually into World War II on the side of the Germans, because he had allied himself with Hitler. So it's a dangerous path when someone who is an autocrat, someone who speaks openly of getting rid of political enemies, someone who speaks openly of getting rid of the civil service and installing loyal party members. One of the first things that Mussolini did was to make university professors sign a loyalty oath. There were 1,200 professors. Out of the 1,200, 11 or 12 refused to sign.
Wow. So
people are willing to go along, and that's the part of obey in the motto. Believe and obey. Timothy Snyder, in his really excellent book about tyranny, on tyranny, his first rule is do not obey in advance. And that's a wise piece of advice for all of us right now.
So many hallmarks, so many parallels and similarities throughout history. One interesting thing that you're seeing now is that a lot of these strong men, a lot of these authoritarians, autocrats, dictators, people want to call them different words. They all are, they have relationships with each other. I think that's important. I wonder if that's something we saw a lot in history. Obviously, you saw the Axis powers, and you just mentioned Mussolini and obviously Hitler. But I mean, now you look at Putin going to North Korea. You look at Brazil's guy, Bolsonaro, who they pushed out. You look at Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey, obviously Xi in China, and Trump in America likes all of them. He speaks highly about all of them, and it would seem all of them want Trump to take power again. And I just wonder about the history of authoritarians sticking together.
Well, I don't know who it was. Somebody wrote in the Times about just this question the other day, that this alliance of these authoritarians right now, they don't share any ideology in the sense that, Putin probably doesn't really share an ideology with Xi, but they share a common goal, and their common goal is to weaken the West. And to weaken the West, one has to first weaken the United States of America in particular. So, everything that's happened in Europe in the past few years has often been driven by Russian, Chinese propaganda, Turkish propaganda. These are all, pretty well established things. And of course, the impact of the internet and social media on what used to be, a simpler world. It's not a simple world anymore, and artificial intelligence is going to make it even worse, we are told. So, I have to say, I've always been a very optimistic person. I've seen the United States come through horrible things. Yeah. I've seen my father, as we've talked before, was a World War II veteran, and I believed in those things that my father and his brothers and his generation went to fight for. And so when I look at those D-Day commemorations a month ago, they're very powerful to me. And this country did go to war to defend democracy, to defeat fascism, to defeat totalitarianism, to defend the rights of people. Well, we aren't a
democracy. We're a republic, is what I hear from a lot of people on the right, Trump supporters. We're not a democracy. This isn't a democracy. It's a republic, Kenneth.
It's a piece of nonsense. And, what do the words mean? Republic is from Latin, and it means of the people. Democracy is from Greek, and it means of the people. There are lots of republics around the world, including the People's Republic of China. It's a nonsensical argument because, of course, it's a democratic republic. It's built into, the Constitution has all these rules for how we are going to vote on things and do it democratically. That's the difference between a democratic republic and the People's Republic of China, where nothing is done democratically. So it's just such an empty and foolish argument, and it's been knocked down many times, but it's a nice, simple talking point for people who don't really know what they're talking about.
Finally, teach us, I'm going to post this on the 4th of July, Independence Day. We used to talk about these holidays and the history of them. Tell me something I don't know, and then I will finally let you go.
Well, my favorite story, because we're talking on July 2nd, is that John Adams thought this would be the day. He wrote back to his wife in Massachusetts from Philadelphia saying, July 2nd will be the most wonderful day. We'll celebrate it with bonfires and parades and illuminations and church bells ringing, because Congress actually voted in favor of a resolution of independence on July 2nd. So Adams thought this would be the day. But 2 days later, Congress, the Continental Congress, adopts the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Jefferson with help from John Adams and Ben Franklin. There was a committee of 5, but Jefferson wrote it, borrowing liberally from other earlier sources. And so almost instantly, this document became synonymous with America and the birth of America. And George Washington had the Declaration of Independence read to the troops in New York City a few weeks later. Philadelphia had a great celebration as soon as it was announced. And a year later, the 4th of July was already being celebrated. It just became established as the nation's birthday. But it's always, it's really important to go back and look at what those words are. And of course, I always have to balance it off by saying these words were written by a man who enslaved hundreds of people and would eventually father children with an enslaved woman. And we always have to keep that in mind. But what Jefferson wrote is still timeless, and it's influenced people over centuries. That we do have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that all men are created equal. And those fundamental ideas have driven us for now almost 250 years. But the most important, and I think it's often missed in what Jefferson wrote, the most important thing I think he said is that no government, no just government, could govern without the consent of the governed. And that puts it on us, that we either consent or we resist. And now is the time for us to, one thing that I've learned about authoritarianism in writing about it a great deal over the last few years is that there are really 3 responses to an authoritarian. You can be a bystander, watch and let it go by and think, well, that's them. It doesn't have anything to do with me. You can be a collaborator and actually get involved. I'm going to, go out and drag those people out of their houses, and I'm going to break the windows of those Jew shopkeepers. Or you can be an upstander. And an upstander is the hardest one to be. An upstander has to stand up and say, this is not right. I am not going to let this stand. I am going to do whatever I can to prevent this. And that's why Timothy Snyder's book is very excellent. It gives 20 lessons for us to stand up for democracy. And so I think this is the time where everyone has to choose, which one am I going to be, a collaborator, an upstander, or a bystander? And
I may change.
It's not an easy choice.
May change the name of the show, Collaborator with Pete Dominick. Stand up. No, I'm an upstander, and I will go down as one, I hope. I said that was the last question, but I forgot to mention, October 4th, I mentioned in the intro, and I'll say it again, in October, I should say, your new book will come out. The World in Books, 52 works of great short nonfiction. You can pre-order it now, anywhere you get books. Do you want to preview this? Obviously, we're going to do a full interview. I've got my advance copy. I'm very excited whenever you publish.
This is a book that I wrote over the last 2 years, The World in Books, 52 works of great short nonfiction. And it's nonfiction that goes from the beginning of recorded history right up into contemporary times. Again, short works, so you can read it in a week. But the idea here is that great writers bring us great ideas, and they make us think. And that's what we need right now. We need people who think for themselves. And so that's what this book is intended to do, to make us all a little bit more learned, because that's not a dirty word, to be learned. And it includes some of the great names in American history, people like Thomas Paine, who wrote something called Common Sense, and we wish there was more common sense right now. So it's a book that really is designed to make us become more thinking, questioning, and intelligent people who will be able to make good decisions. And in doing so, read some great writers throughout history. So I'll be eager to talk about that a lot more next October. It is always a pleasure, Pete. Thank you very much. And happy 4th of July to everyone. And go pursue happiness.
All right, there he goes. Kenneth C. Davis. So great to have him joining me again. It's been far too long. Don'tKnowMuch.com. Get his books, pre-order his new book, and book him to talk at your library or your classroom or anywhere else. His knowledge, so important, so needed right now. So I hope you like that and appreciate it. Let him know. Go on Twitter. He'll see your tweets and all the links to Kenneth C. Davis in today's show notes, as there are for every guest every day. Please write a rating or review on Spotify or iTunes. Those are so valuable. And, of course, subscribe to all my social media. All the links to those are also in the show notes. Go buy this song off of John Carroll if you like it. The show, he does it for free. $3.99 is all you need to pay. Go buy this song at johncarroll.org. And stay with me. I know things are hard right now. I'll continue to be here pretty much every day, trying to do the best I can to bring you the smartest minds and have the best conversations we can with each other as well. Always available on Discord if you're a subscriber. Thank you, Bumblebees. Listen all the way to the end. I love you guys the most. You're my favorites. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Stand up, you gotta stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up. Stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up. People got the power. Stand up. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Stand